Let's talk about the amends letter and the 5 steps to reconciliation. And again, whether it's an adult child or it's a sibling or it is a friend or your parent is the one that pieced out and you don't know why. I can't
Yeah, which
tell
does
you,
happen.
I have sat in the last month next to people on planes who have disclosed to me. One man in particular said, I'm a fan of your podcast. Could you please do something about estrangement?
Oh, really?
And
Wow.
in his case, it was a daughter with mental health issues who they have
Common.
not talked to in 7 years.
Common.
But that's something that I keep thinking about, which is I know a lot of people that are dealing with this.
Yep.
And so I wanted to do an episode because this is way more common than I think the studies even indicate.
I totally agree with you.
And there is a tremendous amount of content. I agree with you. Coaching people to cut people out,
Mm,
to have boundaries, which are important.
sure.
We may differ a little bit in terms of the influence of childhood trauma on
Mm,
adult behavior. I think our difference probably has more to do with how much people lean on it versus taking responsibility for healing it.
sure.
But when you get to that point where you feel like, I don't have the ability to have this person in my life, it's easier to just stop having a relationship with them.
Hmm.
What are the 5 steps for somebody who's on the receiving end of that? Because we don't talk about that a lot. We don't talk a lot about, look, your parents did the best they could.
Mm,
If you look at the way your parents were treated growing up, it explains a lot about what they did.
yeah.
Doesn't justify it, Dr. Coleman,
No, I agree.
but it certainly explains it. So
Right.
what are the 5 steps to reconciliation?
Yeah. Well, it kind of depends on who the person is who's seeking the help. I increasingly am having more adult children contact me who the parents cut them off, or they're
Really?
the ones who want help. Yeah. Or even if the parents haven't cut them off, they just want an improved relationship. And I'm happy that my book speaks to the adult child as well because it was written for the parent. It typically requires leader. I mean, if the adult child contacts me, then I'll reach out to the parent, but I'll also explain to them my method in the same way that if they were the ones who had reached out to me, and I'll say that this is the way that I work. So you need to know that before you sign on to doing any sessions with me. If you imagine that my goal is going to just be to side with you about how terrible your kid is, it's not going to happen. So I'm very clear about that as a kind of a framework. Siblings are more complicated because for parents, it's very easy for me to get a parent to take the high road, to take responsibility because they're in
Hmm.
so much pain. And there's this kind of a role violation of, if a child cuts off a parent, there's a feeling like, well, it is my obligation to heal this. And, I clearly, even if they feel like they're innocent, they can feel a great, enormous sense of shame that their child feels like they've failed them. So it's not, there are parents who won't do what I tell them to do. I can't help them if they will. I tell parents this isn't about right or wrong per se. It's kind of about the practicality. I mean, I do think that there is a moral basis to what I preach. The parents should take the high road. That their children didn't choose to have them, and therefore it is incumbent on parents to take the high road and take responsibility and not get pulled into the weeds, not return fire with fire. But there's not like a third option. Like parents sometimes want me to help them see how unfair their kid is being or that kind of thing. That just doesn't work. But anyway, with siblings, it's more tricky because parents are willing to walk over hot coals, which is sometimes required. But siblings typically aren't. So somebody has to take the high road. Somebody has to be willing to not get pulled into the weeds, to make amends, to probably take more responsibility than they think is fair. I mean, if both siblings are equally motivated to heal the relationship, and I have worked with those kind of siblings, that's easier. Then it's more like marriage therapy. Then you can examine the dynamics that shape them both and get them learn how to communicate more and kind of make the unconscious processes much more conscious. But more typically, one sibling is completely estranged and the other sibling is in pain about the estrangement. So typically the person who's in the most pain has to show more leadership. So
Hmm.
that's the tricky part.
I love what you said before we jump into the 5 steps. I just want to take a highlighter and make sure that everybody heard something that you said. You said that your your personal belief is that the parents have a moral obligation to take the higher road because they chose to bring their children into the world.
Correct.
And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, because you're right, there has been this rise of individualism, and I'm responsible for my happiness. And I don't even know where I was going with it, but I just felt like that's a very profound thing. And I think a lot of times when you get really wrapped up in feeling like things should be fair or your kids owe you something, we forget as parents that we're the ones that brought them into the world.
Right.
They didn't choose us, we chose and created them.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean they owe us anything. If anything, it means we owe them something.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I would say two things to that. One is that I extend that even to wills. Like a lot of the parents in my practice, have been treated miserably by their adult children. And it wouldn't surprise me. I'm sympathetic to some of these parents who want to cut their kids out of their will. But I say I don't support parents doing that.
Why?
Because
it seems like my natural reflection is, of course, if you're going to cut me out of your life, why the fuck would I give you any money? Because I've been paying for your ass your whole adult life. Like, why would I continue to do that if you don't even... Like, do you see how quickly I could go into that I'm an angry, resentful parent?
Sure. Yeah. No.
But why would you say that? Why should somebody who's had a kid cut them out actually give them money?
Yeah, no, I totally understand, and I'm sympathetic to any parent. The reason is that we're parents forever, and we're parenting long after long after we're gone. I mean, my parents, are both dead, and they still continue. Their influence still persists with me. Some good ways and some bad ways. But I don't think our responsibility as parents ends when we die. And as much as I hate the way some of these adult children treat their parents, how contemptuous, how self-righteous, how rejecting they are, how much they've immiserated the life of the parent, I still don't think I still think that the role of parent continues after the parent dies. And it's also a question of, what do you want your legacy to be? Do you want your legacy to be that you punished your child from the grave? And that doesn't mean parents have to give their child every single penny, but that they might give them what they would give them if they were still alive, A, and B, if there's other siblings, it greatly complicates a sibling relationship if one of the children is cut out of the will. Yes, I do think there's a moral obligation to parents. I think there also is a moral obligation to it from adult children that we've lost sight of in this culture. I actually do think that adult children owe the parents something. I don't think that parents can demand that or extract it or guilt trip the child into doing it. But I think as a culture, some of these children who are estranging their parents have been given a quality of life that, their parents would have dreamed of. So the idea that the children just gets to say, well, you didn't go I mean, some of the reasons that adult children cut off contact aren't because the parent was abusive or neglectful. It's because, their therapist has convinced them that the parent was more responsible for how their lives turned out than they were. Or the kid got married to somebody who hates the parent, and the kid isn't strong enough to stand up to their spouse and say, no, they're my parents. I want them to see them, and I want them to see their grandchildren regardless. So I think that in the same way that parents have a moral obligation, I think adult children do too. Now, that doesn't mean that they're obligated to stay in contact no matter how abusive or hurtful or critical or shaming, or rejecting the parent is. But they are morally obligated to give the parent a time of due diligence, to repair, to do therapy, to hear them out, to think of the parent in a more three-dimensional way, to view it from the perspective that you were saying earlier, that they did the best they could, not in a way that they just get to be forgiven no matter how crappy their parenting was, but that a perspective of compassion rather than contempt. So I think both sides, there's moral obligations.
That's beautiful. It's really beautiful because, I know in my own life, and I mentioned about my uncle never meeting his two grandkids, it was heartbreaking that they were at the memorial service.
Yeah.
And I think you probably see that a lot, that people show up in death.
Yeah.
Because there is something deeper that connects us all. And I think that that's what that speaks to. And we have this inability as emotional beings to navigate what feels like endless landmines that
Hmm.
can develop between us. And so, what are the 5 steps that people can take in any situation, in any relationship where there has been an estrangement and you're the one, whether it's you want to take the higher ground or you're the one that's hurting more? What are the steps, doctor?
Yeah. Well, what I often tell parents is there's a lot more things you can do wrong than you can do right. So, the things you can do wrong are contained in the 5 most common mistakes that we've already discussed. The things that you can do right are to show compassion, to take responsibility, to find the kernel, if not the bushel, of truth in a child's complaints, to communicate that that they wouldn't have cut off contact unless they felt like it was the healthiest thing for them to do. If you have no idea what the reasons are, and some parents don't, to say that it's clear I have significant blind spots as a parent or as a person, that I don't have a deeper understanding, but I want to. Would you feel comfortable writing me and telling me more about what your thoughts or feelings are that make you feel like this is the healthiest thing for you to do? I promise to listen or read purely from the perspective of learning and not in any way to defend myself. On the one hand, to not give up, but at some point you might have to stop as a show of respect. So, for example, if you're getting your letters returned unopened, returned to sender, have threats of the police called on you, communicating through an attorney, or your kid just gets so unraveled, then you should just stop completely for a year. Sometimes stopping completely works because the adult child can feel like the parent is respecting their boundaries finally. It can make them respect the parent more, that they're not just continuing to try no matter what. That old saying, how can I miss you if you don't go away, is sometimes true in family life. It can create,
Mm.
that sort of space for the adult child to come into. So there's a lot of reasons why sometimes just stopping completely is the right thing. But a lot of it, and this is particularly true of parents who've been victims of parental alienation, where they've been brainwashed against the parent by the other parent after a divorce, is to embody what I call kind of the lighthouse model, that you're just there on the beach, you're steady, you're like broadcasting light from this definite point on the beach while your child is being pushed up and down out at sea by the waves. And sometimes they'll come out and see you standing on the beach there broadcasting light, and they'll get oriented towards you, but then they'll be carried back out to sea and pushed underwater again. But your task as a parent is to be steady and loving and compassionate and available and responsibility taking, and hope that over time your child can find their way back to you through those efforts.
Can you define or can you describe what an amends letter is and how you write one?
Sure. First of all, they're much shorter than parents often think they should be. Typically, 2 paragraphs is as much as I recommend. You don't want it
Wow.
to be so long that, sort of so much rope that you're going to hang yourself with it. They should be courageous. In AA, they talk about making a fearless and searching moral inventory of your character flaws. I think the same is true of an amends letter. To if your child has made complaints about you, to be able to really fearlessly say what those were and how you can see how that could have impacted your child, how that might have been hurtful or traumatizing to them or damaging to them or affected their feelings of trust or safety or security in you or the relationship with you. That's critically important, to not blame anybody else, to not make excuses, to not say, well, I was a single mother, well, your dad didn't pay any child support, or well, your mother blame me for divorce when it wasn't my fault, or you had ADD or learning disabilities, or you had your own issues, or no, no, and no. It's 100% about empathy, responsibility taking. But there has to be blood on the tracks, meaning that the parent has to actually do show courage in facing their own character flaws, not in a self-hating way, but just in a way, and that's critically important as well. It shouldn't be an exercise in masochism, even though it is a painful thing to do. I understand from my own personal experience. They're not fun letters to write. They're actually super hard
What was it
letters.
like for you to write one to your daughter when she cut you off?
Well, I mean, there's 2 things that go into it. One is this going to work? And the other is just having to face the reality of some of her complaints. I mean, I can empathize with the ways that she felt sort of sidelined when I remarried and had their children, and how my children from my current marriage had a much better quality of life and were raised in the context of a stable marriage, and she didn't have that, and she was, kind of went back and forth between two homes. There was conflict with me and her mother, and there's a lot there to be hurt and upset and feel displaced about. So it was very painful. It was, there've been numerous times where we've cried together about it because it was, yeah, it's just really painful.
What was her response to your letter?
Good. I mean, she, to her credit, what I tell parents is I was just lucky that my daughter had whatever it is that causes an adult child to forgive and to accept. Not all parents, there are parents who are just as dedicated or empathic as me or communicate just as well or better than I did, who's the adult child wasn't or isn't willing or able to do that. But I was lucky that she was able to. Now, it didn't happen right away, and it often doesn't. That's why I say it's often a marathon, not a sprint. So took a while, and actually we had a number of conversations. It wasn't just like one simple thing like, oh, great, clouds have parted, all is forgiven. No, it still comes up periodically. I mean, not a lot, but those kind of things are fault lines in a parent-adult-child relationship that probably exist in some form. Will always be there in one form or another.
What if you're the one that's in the middle? So I've been in a situation where my two closest friends, one cut the other one off and didn't talk to her for 3 years.
Yep.
And I was in a relationship with both of them. And one kept trying to reconcile and absolute stonewall from the other.
Yeah.
What do you do if you're the sibling or the other child or you're kind of the friend in the middle?
Yeah, well, it's often that a sibling will be one child is estranged and the other sibling is not estranged from the parents. And what I tell parents is you can't really have your non-estranged child advocate for you. First of all, if one of your children is estranged from you, they're showing that they're capable of using estrangement, so they may well estrange that sibling. Second of all, the sibling may say that if you're acting like our parents' advocate, I will cut you off, or if you tell them anything that I'm telling you. So often the estranged sibling makes the non-estranged sibling swear, that they won't reveal what their reasons are, what they're thinking or feeling, sometimes even where they live. So I tell parents that they have to accept that boundary and limit as difficult as it is. The other thing I tell parents is that, if you have one kid who's estranged, you don't want the non-estranged kids to feel like they have to sort of hold up some mirror of you as the great parent. They know how much pain you're in. So you're better off saying to them something like, look, your sister or your brother's estranged. Either we don't understand it or we do understand it, but I don't want you to feel like you have to sort of, repair my self-esteem by making me feel like I'm a great parent or whatever. You may have the same complaints about me or you may have different complaints, but I want you to feel like that there's room to do that without worrying about being overly burdensome to me. Now, if you're the friend, it's sort of a similar dynamic where you don't really have that kind of power to really change very, very much about it. And you don't really won't serve your friendship to be overly allied one against the other, even if you think that, one person's more at fault or more troubled or more difficult. We've all got, probably most of us have at least one difficult friend, right? So we can be sympathetic to the other friend who's on the receiving end of that. But if you put yourself in a position of advocacy, it's not typically wanted. And so that can cause the person who's being advocated against to feel more misunderstood or ganged up on and that kind of thing.
I think if there's one thing I'm taking away from this incredible conversation is that when this happens, there's typically on the part of the person that is estranged this story or feeling that you just don't get it.
Yeah.
And
right.
I'm tired of trying to explain it. And I'm tired of you defending yourself. And it's just easier and better for me to remove this from my life right now.
Yeah.
And that's why everything that you're counseling us, which is the opposite of how you're going to feel when you
Right.
feel wronged or hurt or desperate to reconnect with somebody, that really you have to step into the shoes of the other person or at least give them the experience that you have as much as it may seem unfair, or it may seem like it's one-sided, or it may seem just, I don't know. Like I'm sitting here, I can't even put myself in the shoes of somebody who's experiencing this, even though there's estrangement on both sides of my family, in extended family. And even though my two best friends didn't talk for 3 years, and even though, like, I see examples of this everywhere,
Yeah.
and it must be a profoundly painful and challenging and humbling thing to do, to say, this is so important to me that I'm going to be the leader in this process. And the only way that we're going to make progress is if the person that's cut me out actually feels like they've been validated and understood without me defending myself.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. I think it's a really good summary of what this looks like and feels like. And one of the challenges is that generations are often talking past each other. So important article by Nick Haslam, who's an Australian psychologist, and he called it concept creep. And what he found was that over the past 3 decades, well, his article came out in 2015, so it's more than that at this point, but there's been an expansion of what we consider to be hurtful, traumatic, abusive, neglectful behavior. So often the adult child saying is, you neglected me, you were emotionally abusive, you traumatized me, and the parents are like, what? Because they're looking at it from the way those terms were defined when they were growing up, whereas the adult child is looking at it in a very different way. So often, if the adult child saying you emotionally abused me, the parents, particularly a lot of these parents who've given their children a really good quality of life, just can't relate to it. And so what I tell parents to say is, I wasn't aware that it's clear that I have blind spots, that I wasn't aware that felt emotionally abusive to you. I'm glad you let me know. I would like to learn more about what that felt like to you, how that's impacted you. Is there something you'd like me to read? Would you like to get into therapy around it? Are there things you'd like me to work on in my own therapy? So again, it's kind of to the point that you were making. The parent has to really go toward the adult child's complaints rather than away from them. They do have to show a certain amount of courage and willingness to kind of get into the really painful territory of how the child feels like they neglected them or hurt them or let them down. And no parent really particularly wants to go there.
Definitely
It's
not.
not a fun place to be.
So when you get to the point where it's like, okay, I have gotten the message, you don't want to talk, I'm going to just go silent for a year. Do you send somebody flowers on their birthday? Do you
I
send,
don't.
like, how do you engage with somebody who doesn't want to engage with you?
Yeah, well, there's a difference between a kid who's a minor, which I would say that parents shouldn't give up, whereas versus a kid who's more full-fledged adult. So no, I think if somebody if somebody's going to let the line go cold per my recommendations, I recommend they don't do anything, because I think that for some adult children, they really need to feel that parent's absence. For some estrangements, they're really trying to get in touch with a certain part of themselves that they don't feel like they can access with the parent involved in their life. The parent in some ways is too important in their mind. The parent feels really unimportant, but it's in part because the adult child is sort of closed off contact in every avenue of access to that parent. So it's that feeling that the parent feels cut off because they haven't cut off. But the adult child is doing it because they feel like the parent's too important in their mind. So if the parent can do that, can be no contact in the same way that the adult child is requesting, then it allows the adult child to feel themselves in a different way in relationships with the parent. So it's what I call lose your parent, find yourself.
If there was ever a podcast episode to listen to, I think it's this one, because I think the research is wrong. I think that at some point this is going to impact all of us. What am I talking about? I'm talking about estrangement.